Hey folks, before we get started, I did want to reiterate a portion of osteoprogenitor cells or bone stem cells because I did make a mistake in how I was telling you. Number one, the bone stem cells or osteoprogenitor cells are going to create osteoblasts, and then those osteoblasts become osteocytes. Osteoclasts are formed from red marrow or the white blood cells of the red marrow. So they are not formed from osteoprogenitors like I was saying before. That was me misspeaking and mixing up all these different terms. So I do apologize, but luckily my brain was like, something ain't right, so I was able to come back and handle this mistake. Again, osteoprogenitor cells or bone stem cells are going to be able to make osteoblasts, and those osteoblasts are going to be used to help form and secrete that extracellular matrix and, of course, form osteocytes. The next type of cell is going to be our osteoclast, which we know is all about breaking down our actual bone to help release calcium, for example, or to just help with remodeling. But that's going to specifically be formed from red marrow, which of course we know makes blood cell components. And one of those blood cell components is white blood cells. So I just want to keep that in mind, and it will be reiterated when we get to microscopic anatomy, but I just want to make sure that mistake is clear as day here and not something that has caused confusion. I do apologize. Let's get into our last piece of bone structure, which is going to be bone markings. So of course, we're talking about the gross anatomy. We learned about the components of bone and how it's organized, and the classification of bones before this, right? But we also might be thinking, okay, well, what about all the little projections that I see on the bones? What about all the surfaces that form joints or the little depressions or openings that I see on the bone? How is that going to help me with identification? Well, that's going to help again with specifically location of the bone. So remember when we talk about classification, we said we can just have a pile of bones and of course put them or organize them based on shape. But now we can even add more different markings on the bone that can help us figure out where they might be as far as location. But again, you would have to use both in order to figure out exactly what type of bone you're dealing with. Now, the three types of bone markings we're going to talk about are going to be projections. So this is where muscles and ligaments are going to attach. Surfaces that help to form joints. And finally, depressions and openings. This is really where you're going to have a passage for blood vessels and nerves. It's a lot to learn. Even though they're broken into three pieces, it is still a lot to learn. So what we're going to be doing is, of course, going to the next slide where I'm just trying to hopefully give examples to help you remember stuff. And one cool thing that you can do in lab is to make sure that you actually feel some of these bone markings as well. So let's get into that. There's going to be a lot of bone markings that we see, and I should be able to get through all of them here. All right. First, we're going to focus on the humerus. So this is going to be the humerus. Then we're going to have our femur, we're going to have the skull, and of course our pelvis here. Okay, and we're going to be able to see bone markings based on what we see here. Now, next to the bone markings, I will be putting P for projection, S for surface, or DO for depressions or openings. Now, here's our humerus. Now, of course, you're like, this is a long bone, so yes, it has the diaphysis, the epiphysis, for example. Well, our focus is going to be bone markings. And the first bone marking I'm going to focus on is the head. Now, the head is going to stay as an expanded proximal end of a bone that forms part of a joint. So we're already thinking that's going to be in the proximal end, and because it's dealing with the joint, we know this is going to be an S for surface bone marking. Okay? Now let's move into a tubercle. A tubercle is a small, rounded projection, and a tubercle is going to be a projection, so we definitely are going to write P for projection here. Okay? So again, if you were to see the proximal end of a humerus, then you know that you're dealing with the head of the humerus, and then if you were to see a small little rounded projection around it, that would be the tubercle. Now the sulcus, which can also be called a groove, is a deep, narrow groove, and it's usually going to be there to as a pathway for tendon, nerves, or blood vessels. And because it is a little bit of a groove or opening, we're going to call this a groove or opening, so we're going to put depression/opening here. Now, a tuberosity is going to be a small, rough projection that may occupy a broad area of the bone surface. What does that mean? A tuberosity is literally just going to be a kind of a roughened projection. So on here, you might see a porosity where you're actually going to have attachments to the bone itself of some kind of ligament, for example. And that will be what that little rough edge is. So a lot of times when you pick a bone, you're expecting it to be all compact bone and all smooth. Well, no. On that diaphysis, you will be seeing a little rough edge, which would be a tuberosity. And because it's a projection, it's kind of poking out of the actual bone itself, we know that this is going to be a projection. Now, the diaphysis is just going to be a labeling of this bone, so we don't have to worry about that. Let's go ahead and go to our trochleae, or trochlea. This is going to be something that we don't have to really focus on for our projections that we're trying to look at here. So let's move on to a condyle. And a condyle is going to be a smooth, rounded, articular process. So as you can see, when you're thinking of long bones, you're like, hey, there's going to be articular cartilage that's going to be at the ends of both the epiphysis, the proximal and the distal. Well, a condyle is going to be that smooth, rounded, articular process. It's only going to be a piece of it, okay? The way to distinguish a condyle is that it's going to articulate with some type of fossa. And a fossa is going to be a depression or opening. And so that means it's going to be right there where you have a little depression in the bone that's going to help make that connection, okay? And because we're talking about connection, that will be a surface bone marking. Now, another kind of marking that will be around this condyle area is going to be a projection. And that's going to be the epicondyle. So let me go ahead and write that down. So we definitely are going to say that is a projection, but it's going to be called the epicondyle. So epi, we know, is going to be upon or above. And so this would be considered an epicondyle. It's kind of like above the actual condyle itself. Sometimes it will be more close to the diaphysis. It just depends. And it's always going to be some type of raised area above that condyle. So yes, this is another bone marking you will see. Let's move on to our femur bone here. And let's get into if we see projections, depressions or openings, or surface. So first we have a trochanter, and a trochanter is going to be a projection. So let me make sure I have the right color before I start tripping. Okay. It's going to be another projection. The head here is just the same kind of head we talked about before as a surface. The neck is, again, extra information we don't have to really focus on, but it just can help you like see things. That's going to be the connection between the head of the bone and the diaphysis, for example. The diaphysis is just labeling as well. Then we have a facet, which is going to be a surface projection. Let me go ahead and get that. We have another surface projection here. And of course, the condyle we see is another surface projection. So let's go ahead and talk about our, not a surface projection, I'm talking about a surface bone marking. Let's talk about our projection bone markings, okay? So the trochanter is going to be a large, rough projection. So let's just keep that in mind. It's going to be very large. It's going to look irregular, irregularly shaped or odd shaped, okay? And usually you're going to mainly see this in the femur only. So that's going to be what a trochanter is. Yes, we have the head here, which is going to be a joint connection because it's a surfaced bone marking. And then again, we have a condyle as well. Let's talk about what a facet is, though. A facet is going to be a small, flat, articular surface, what we have written down here. And just to make sure we understand, because we're talking about something that is a surface, it's all about helping form joints. So it's going to be a flat, articular surface, okay? And that's what you see here as far as the facet. And sometimes when you see a bone, you see like this nice little shiny piece there. That will be considered a facet. And yes, you can have a facet that's on a condyle, for example. And even when you're looking at a condyle here, I definitely mix this up. So it'll be YL, if you already know. But even though you're looking at a condyle here that's surface, it can also become a projection if it's an epicondyle. Let's go ahead and go to the skull so we can get more information about this as well. Now, for the skull, you can have a canal. Of course, this is also going to be a meatus. And this canal or meatus is going to be a depression/opening. We can have a process, which is going to be a projection. We can also have a sinus, which is also going to be a depression/opening, a foramen, or of course foramen, which we saw in our diaphysis. That's going to help us. We saw a nutrient foramen that's going to help us be able to get blood vessels and nerves into the actual bone matrix. And that's also going to be depression slash opening, because we know it's a small hole, and also a fissure, which is also a depression slash opening. So a lot of depression slash openings on the skull itself. Now let's go ahead and get some details for these. So what is a meatus or canal? It's going to be a canal-like passageway. That's it. It's a large passageway through the bone. And so of course it's kind of harder to see, but you'll have like little canals right here. Let me erase that so I can at least just point to it. This is a canal right here, okay? And we have it labeled on that side. We also have a sinus. It's just a chamber that's going to be within bone that's going to be filled with air. We got a bunch of those little sinuses as well. Foramen, again, a small hole or rounded passageway, and that's how we're going to get our blood. We have foramens all around. That's how we're getting our blood vessels and our nerves to penetrate bone. And then we also have a fissure. So a fissure is going to be a narrow slit-like opening. So those can be harder to see, but a narrow slit-like opening would be a fissure like here. You can see another one over here, okay? Now back to our projections, bone markings, and that's what the process is here. So when you touch your cheekbone, for example, and you're like, oh, I'm touching my cheekbone, and you feel like it kind of gonna project out a little bit, like very bumpy, or it's like very bony and prominent. You know, I have high cheekbones, so when I tap on them, like, yeah, it's very prominent going up, then that's going to be considered a process. Okay? Now let's go ahead and finally get into our pelvis, and we see even more of some different types of bone markings. First, let's focus on projections. So we see a crest, which is a projection here. We also see a line, which is a projection. We see a spine, which is a projection, and a ramus, which is also a projection, but we don't really focus. And then finally, we also see a depression slash opening, which is a fossa. So let's get into these details. Let's go with the depression slash opening first. Now, a fossa is going to be a shallow depression in the bone. So we see like a shallow depression or recessed surface of the bone here. Like a shallow little depression is hard because this is in 3D. But if you had a piece of your pelvis, a right or left side, you'll see that kind of shallow depression that's going to be in a larger piece of this pelvic bone. And that's what a fossa is. Now let's go ahead and get into our projections, bone markings, to end it here. First, we have a crest, which is going to be a prominent ridge of the bone itself. We have a crest, okay? And that crest is just going to be usually a narrow ridge of bone, but it's very prominent. Then we have a line, which is a low ridge, more delicate than a crest. So as you can see, our crest is going to be like it's a narrow ridge of bone, but again, it's more prominent, whereas a line is still a narrow ridge of bone, but it's just less prominent. And so that's going to be kind of hard to distinguish between the two. But you really have to look at it as, is it kind of coming out more at you, or is it just a line of narrow bone, okay? Then we have our spine, which is going to be a sharp, slender, pointed projection or a narrow process. Like we see here, it's like a little pointed area here. And remember we were talking about the vertebrae a lot. Well, the vertebrae does have the spiny processes that are coming out of it as well for bone markings. And then finally, a ramus is going to be a thick projection. Again, that makes an angle with the main body of the bone, and that's what we can see that here in the pelvis, but that's not one you have to memorize. There's a lot here that you will be responsible for. So again, I recommend just taking a picture of the actual of a bone, like a humerus, a femur, or again the skull and pelvis, especially when you're in a lab, and just start touching and feeling things and making your own connections to that as well. All right, folks, let's move on to microscopic anatomy.